To jump right into things, the biggest thing in nuclear news and recent nuclear news about Iran was Stuxnet and its impact on Iran's nuclear program. One of the most interesting things to me about that was the method of infection. Some of the companies targeted ostensibly had nothing to do with Iran's nuclear program, but it seemed to work its way inside Natanz. Is there anything more known about how that happened?
Well, Symantec did a kind of an analysis of using the software itself to try to figure out where the initial infection started. Stuxnet records every time that it infects a computer with the domain name and the computer name, and so you get a history of the infection in the various versions of Stuxnet. And so Symantec unwound that and came up that there were 5 sites or companies that were initially infected, and some more than once. I think one was infected on 3 different occasions. And from what I understand, most of these infections would have been by a memory stick or some kind of electronic medium that was stuck into the PC and then infected it. I mean, it's possible it came in by email in one case, but I think it was mostly removable drives that infected the computer. 4 of the infections happened in the summer of 2009. And then there was a reinfection of those 4 companies in the spring of 2010, and a new company was infected at that time. And the companies' names are known publicly. Symantec's taken the position they're not going to release the names. They feel that these were companies that were victims of malware, and therefore they're not going to publicize the names to either on a private level or a public level. I was able to learn some things about the companies, one of which is that some are involved in process of selling or handling industrial control equipment. Companies could be involved in procuring Siemens controllers from abroad, could be involved in readying them for use by a client. Some of the companies were on public lists identifying companies that were under sanctions because of UN Security Council resolutions or national laws such as the U.S. sanctions laws. And what that means is that those companies were somehow involved in procuring things overseas and then doing so in a way that ended them in some kind of legal trouble or under suspicion that they were procuring in violation of UN sanctions or national sanctions. The companies looked like they were part of the supply chain for Natanz. They wouldn't have been nuclear necessarily. These were companies that looked like they were going to provide the equipment that the Natanz facility would use in order to control the plant. There was one company that was involved in procuring Siemens controllers, a variety of those controllers and ancillary equipment and software for the nuclear establishment in 2003-2004. And it was a sale by Siemens to the Iranian company. Siemens didn't know it was for the nuclear program, but intelligence agencies learned that. The IAEA learned it and then told Siemens. And Siemens then took the policy that it would no longer sell to Iranian entities if there were suspicions it could go into the nuclear program. And if they did have Siemens controllers, most likely they had acquired them through what we call illicit nuclear trade, and had been involved in buying these things illegally overseas and then using them to outfit a centrifuge program in violation of the UN Security Council resolutions, which call for suspension of operations in Natanz. And so at ISIS, we felt these companies are, in essence, are part of a criminal conspiracy to violate UN Security Council's resolutions, and therefore their name should be made public.
To me, it sounds a lot like what I used to run up against in my old job as a counterproliferation division. We'd see Iranian companies mutate. Once you got one shut down, they would open up under a different name, maybe a different location, perhaps with an office in Dubai or somewhere else, and just go back to procuring the same kind of materials. One thing that was interesting to me is, as I understand it, there were 2 chunks of code in there attacking those Siemens controllers that you referred to. One was active and one remained inactive. Why put it in if you're not going to use it?
I think the interpretation that Symantec took was that it could be code that was in the process of being finished, because the remote websites for Stuxnet could update the code. And in fact, we know they did update the code in the spring of 2010 to make it spread more easily. In fact, that's actually why we think it actually was discovered. It was spreading much more easily, so it got out into the mainstream society and then was detected by security companies outside Iran. So they can change it, and so that was one interpretation. But it is a mystery. I mean, and I must say at ISIS, what we were trying to do was understand the target of Stuxnet and just try to figure out what did the code intend to do. And so in the inactive code, there's a data block that's missing that tells you what the target is. So you actually don't know what was the intended target in a centrifuge plant. There are two parts to the code, too. There's a Windows code and there's a machine language code, and they're related, obviously. Symantec said that the reason it was inactive was because of things they saw in the Windows side of the code and that it just would not execute. On the machine language, I mentioned the data block was missing, but there was other data in the machine language code that had a very unique signature of a gas centrifuge at Natanz. These are very old centrifuges that are at Natanz. They go back 30, 40 years actually. The types of arrangements of these things, they're called cascades, are pretty old-fashioned, and it had the exact layout of a cascade at Natanz that is known to the International Atomic Energy Agency. And so we thought that was a clear signature that at least whatever this attack sequence was going to do, it was going to target the Natanz plant.
Just recently, you said you had been attending a conference by the Carnegie Institute, I believe, and the subject was Stuxnet. What other topics of concern related to that? I mean, obviously, we know it hurt Iran's program, but was there anything else in there of interest that came up that sticks in your mind?
About Stuxnet or about Iran? About
Stuxnet in Iran and perhaps the wider implications. I mean, we've already seen a person who claimed to be an Iranian hacker attack a company in New Jersey called Komodo and get them to provide false security certificates. And some people thought that was in revenge for Stuxnet.
These methods have obvious appeal to intelligence agencies. And so I think that they're not going to go away. But they also have effects, and one of which is Iran feels like it's been attacked and feels that it has to defend itself, and part of defense is an offense. And so I would expect that Iran would be thinking of launching cyber attacks or having the capability to launch cyber attacks against its adversaries. And I think other countries are going to look at all this and go, well, we better ratchet up our defense and offense capabilities. So I think we may be entering an era of increased cyber warfare, and I think that is happening without any real debate.
My concern is not so much Iran directly as it is that Iran is good friends with China, and China is extremely aggressive. So if Iran goes to their good friends in China, who are making multi-billion-dollar investments in Iran's oil infrastructure, and says, hey, we've been attacked, why don't you help us set up something to defend ourselves, that the Chinese would be more than happy to help them leapfrog their cyber capability. And that, to me, is kind of what's worrying there.
No, it's a very good point. I mean, and had thought of that particular scenario, but it's a good one.
Certainly, from what I understand of the way it was targeted, it went after very, very specific things, and it is worrying to think, well, other people may take the underlying idea, but not go to the effort to make sure they're only targeting one very narrow, specific piece of a particular infrastructure and making sure there's no collateral damage.
Yeah.
I think Richard Clark was mentioned in the Vanity Fair article that's on your website, and he had what I thought was some interesting insight, which was a lot of effort was given making sure that this targeted a very, very narrow range, and that suggested to him that there were lawyers looking at it to make sure that there was minimal collateral damage. And I thought that was very astute. Having been on the inside, I thought that was probably a dead-on assessment. But
no, it makes sense. No, it does. And there were a lot of hurdles or criteria that had to be seen by the Stuxnet code before it would launch an attack, which also means they knew a lot about the Natanz plant, which was another indicator to us in the fall that this was not a hacker. This was a country or countries. The impressive part was knowing so much about Natanz that you could create those criteria and have an attack that could actually do damage to centrifuges. So it was, I think, quite an impressive achievement to get the insider information in order to do this.
It was truly the cyber equivalent of a rapier thrust and not a JDAM being dropped on something. Moving on, I know that national intelligence estimates are not publicly released, but every time a new one comes out, a lot of the main points, if not the underlying intelligence they're based on, become known officially or unofficially. Has anything struck you about how the assessment, the most recent assessment, has changed since the last NIE in 2007?
What I can discern is that there's been this dispute among the United States and essentially Europe over, did Iran restart its nuclear weaponization program after 2003. And the 2007 NIE had taken the position that the program had stopped and had been unlikely to have restarted. Our allies in Europe, particularly Britain, France, and Germany, felt that in 2006 or 2007, the nuclear weaponization effort was active, and that it wasn't necessarily that they decided to build a bomb. They didn't say there was evidence that a decision had been made to build a bomb, but they were detecting work on aspects of Iran developing the capability to make or acquire capabilities. And the U.S. takes a position no. And so one of the things that appears in this new NIE, as best as I can determine, is the U.S. has kind of walked back from its position that there's no ongoing weaponization work. They clearly say that there's no evidence that a decision has been made to make nuclear weapons. But I think our European allies shared that assessment too. And I've heard it from one European state that they've been unable to detect any decision-making discussions or policy apparatus around the supreme leader about this question of should Iran build nuclear weapons. So I think there seems to be more convergence on this issue that Iran is making progress on building the nuclear weapon itself. It's a very old program, and it was pretty large prior to its kind of either shutdown or slowdown in 2003, depending on your perspective. And so they probably know how to make a nuclear explosive device. If they had a test and they had enough highly enriched uranium, they could probably do it pretty successfully. They've miniaturized their weapon. They can put it on a missile. And their problem seems to be some of the harder to make components and reliability. But they're pretty far along the road. And I think from the International Atomic Energy Agency's point of view, which looked at a lot of this pre-2004 evidence, is that it's just a matter of time for them to complete a reliable warhead armed with highly enriched uranium.
That's unfortunately pretty much what I'd felt troubling. In a piece I wrote for the Washington Post to discuss how, working for the Counterproliferation Division, you work to try to penetrate black or covert WMD programs. When you try to penetrate one of those programs, you really usually can't get access to the scientists involved since they're literally being hidden away or shielded. And so one of the ways you try and figure out what's going on is the same way an astronomer guesses about what's going on inside a black hole, which is to say, since you can't see inside of a black hole, you make an educated guess by observing what's falling into them. What are some of the more notable things Iran has done to try to get their hands on that suggest a nuclear bomb and not just nuclear energy? For example, I read something, I think it was last year, about neutron initiators in the Post.
Right. Yeah, there was a couple things. On the procurement side, there were very fast cameras that Iran was buying in Russia from a company where it has a logo on its website and a picture, I should say, on its website. And these fast cameras can be used to do research on lightning, but they can also be used to do research on nuclear weapons components, high explosive parts of the weapon. And in this picture, you saw a lightning flash on one side, and on the other, a mushroom cloud. And so the company was well aware of the capabilities of their cameras, and they nonetheless sold some to Iran.